From Southern California, this is The Circle of Insight, a show about everything in psychology. Hear the latest in news and views on psychology. Our motto is simple: wherever there is psychology involved, we are there. And now, here's your host of The Circle of Insight, Carlos Vasquez.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today, Dr. Welner will be answering some tough questions about neuro-law. When is a criminal really guilty of what he's doing? Does he have the free will, or does he not? Does some kind of mental health issues control him more than his consciousness does? So we're going to try to talk about this with Dr. Michael Welner. Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Welner.
Thank you for having me, and I really appreciate the sensitivity of the topic, and it's obscure for many, so it's helpful to scrutinize it.
Yeah, and I think it's been around. You're going to have to forgive me, but I think it's about 140 years. That the original case was the McNaughton case.
Well, that's the case that really has an impact on law today, is the McNaughton ruling. And of course, there are many examples of famous insanity cases, but the McNaughton rule has great influence on just the notion of legal insanity being defined as a person's inability to understand the wrong of their actions, to know the wrong, to appreciate the wrong of one's actions, that being the threshold for legal insanity.
And that, I guess, is almost the same definition as neuro-law, or is there a different definition for neuro-law?
I think that there may be. You know, where we are at right now with neurology and in particular neuroimaging, the understanding of the brain has exploded so much that in a way we've almost gone too far too fast. We're trying to catch up to what we know. And a perfect example of this relates to criminal responsibility. We understand aspects of behavior in such a biological way, such a particularized way, that it makes it so much easier to believe that people are passive and they're not in control of their actions, and that there's some sort of chemical reaction that triggers something. There's enough truth to the fine points of neurochemistry and neuroanatomy that we can better appreciate what leads to violence and what leads to murder. But the idea of saying that we're reduced to molecules and reduced to an anatomy, and again, ignoring free will, may just be a place where we haven't yet caught up to. It's almost like the application of genetics. Now, there's a lot more that we understand about genetics and crime and genetics and mental illness, but the idea of like a murder gene, no way are we there yet. And I can explain in a moment why that is, just at a forensic psychiatric level.
Yeah, actually, that'd be great. Because I know.
Well, then I'll jump into it. Let me tell you know, this is. Let me back up, because this is I think a very key orientation point. Looking at it biologically, we can say, all right, this neuroanatomy and this neurochemistry and this antidepressant and this condition and these symptoms. But based on my experience of well over 20 years in practice, and probably having examined about close to 200 murders, if not more, and many people who were involved in violent crime, I would tell you that it's actually much more simple. It involves two basic processes. One is the motivation to do, the choice to kill, or in certain instances, an affected choice because someone has an illness or is in some way impaired. But there's that action, there's that force, whatever's behind it, and there's the inhibition that would have normally held that back, that either gets withdrawn or isn't there at all. So you have the go and the no-go. And it's a go and an absence of a no-go, or a combination of both. And so if one approaches it from that reference point, then one can appreciate there are a whole range of motives: greed, lust, revenge, anger, covering up a crime. But they all fit into an impulse, a drive, maybe even something predatory. I want what you have. What I want is worth more than your life. And an impulse that would otherwise be controlled. I could never do that. How can you take a person's life? Versus, so what? And so the combination of that is essential to forensic examination. What were the driving forces? What were the instigators? What was the history? What was the trigger? And then looking at the individual involved, what would normally get in the way? Is there a violence history? Is this the way this person normally acts? Since when? All of his life? In what situations are those controls loosened or not? So one has to take that reference point and fit it into the biology, not the other way around. Because otherwise, the neurolaw ceases to be a human endeavor. And forensic psychiatry is, make no mistake about it, this is a human practice. It may deal with inhumanity, but if you don't approach it on human terms, you're wrong in your assessment. You're missing something. And so when neurological advances embed themselves in a human context, hey, that's great. It's very eye-opening. But when they don't, it's kind of like a musician who walks into a band in which he's never played with, and before you know it, the other musicians just stop and say, hey, who invited you in here? It just doesn't go. It goes on paper. It goes on paper, but it's not real. It doesn't have an authenticity. That's why, you can bring up genetics, you can bring up neuroimaging and say, okay, well, it's very interesting. That's very interesting. But if it doesn't embed in the context of the individual, then it's a red herring. You just take it, interesting, but toss it.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Now, would you incorporate both nature and nurture then in determining the strength of a go or a no-go impulse on a person?
I think it's very sensible too. The appropriate practice is everyone has a different style. My style is to learn what I can about the moments that led up to a fork, a decision point, in which a person then elected to act violently, homicidally, and then to work backward. To understand the direct antecedents, then to get to know the history, then to get to know the individual. Because when one then works backwards, and then not only the before of the crime, but the during and after, before, during, after. But when one works backwards in that fashion, one can then identify a whole series of questions to say, hey, there are a variety of explanations for the go and the no-go. How do I better understand which ones have more evidence behind them? And then you go to the neuro. And then you go to the other kind of medical and perhaps even genetic explanations and say, hey, maybe, I wonder whether X is present, because these would be the conditions under which X is present, and I've gotten to know the crime well enough. What sometimes happens, and it's when it's turned upside down, is someone who with very little information, an effort will go out, give this guy a PET scan, and show, well, gee, the colors are a little bit different. So, of course, he could never control his impulses. Meanwhile, while the attorney is making that argument, he's sitting in court and controlling his impulses just fine, thank you. And when he goes back into the jail, if he didn't control his impulses, well, somebody would beat the hell out of him. So it's an obviously contradictory argument. My point is that if the neuro and the genetics and all of these advances in technology embed themselves in the humanity of the individual, then it can have great relevance, case by case basis.
That's an excellent argument. Never heard it put that way before. So we're going to explore a little bit more into the neuropsychology component. Is it possible to say that a criminal that maybe has an attenuated prefrontal cortex can lack sympathy, moral reasoning? Would that constrain their free will?
I think that it's well established that people with an attenuated prefrontal cortex have a diminished conscience and have an affected judgment. However, it affects their free will only insofar as they will not have the level of anxiety and inhibition to make destructive choices that others with conscience would make. It does not mean that they don't have free will, because they're still selective about the individuals that they target in order to prey upon. They don't just sexually assault and mutilate anybody. They do so opportunistically and in a way that will avoid capture. And so the minute one gets into the opportunistic quality of that person with an attenuated prefrontal cortex, sure, there are aspects of a person who makes a decision that others would never make, but the idea of a lack of a free will, he's still making that decision at an appointed time with an appointed target and in an appointed place, and deciding not to do it at other times. So it gets you part of the way there, but it still can only get one so far in the way of explaining away catastrophic behavior.
That's a great answer. Are courts allowing PET scans right now?
Yes.
Oh, they are now?
Yes, they are, as well they should. But the question is, does a PET scan embed itself in the context of an individual? Or is it, are PET scans simply being introduced to say, this tells you all you need to know about an individual? If you were to come to me and I was your physician and you would tell me, I have pain in my chest, but I'm not going to tell you anymore. And I would get an x-ray. Would I then just get the x-ray and say, well, this tells me everything that's going on with you? Well, of course not. I would listen to your lungs. I would take other history. I would take some blood work. I would get a much more complete understanding of your own medical background. Then I would look at the same chest x-ray and I would say, hey, you know what? I see something in that chest x-ray that if I didn't know everything I knew, I never would have spotted that. Otherwise, that chest x-ray is a non-specific finding. And so it is with a PET scan. The colors may be fancy, they may be eye-catching, but at the end of the day, it's no different from using any other kind of medical test with no reference point. It just becomes very non-specific, and what kind of conclusions, especially in a legal context, would have any validity with that limited amount of data?
Excellent. I guess my last question for this segment, it kind of steers away a little bit from the neuro component, but I know you're a forensic psychiatrist. We don't have very many of those, I don't think. Are there any differences in the psychophysiological indicators between a killer and a non-killer? Such as like a low heart rate, some studies have done low heart rates in killers compared to non-killers. Anything else that you've known?
I think that there are many, and we're only starting to discover them. The psychopath has attracted so much more study simply because the symptoms of psychopathy can be identified. And yet, we understand what sadists are. Sadists are exceptional individuals. Many are psychopaths, some are not, but the two are not synonymous groups, and yet sadists can be unusually destructive individuals. The psychophysiology of sadism has not necessarily been explored. And again, what is sadism when you consider everything we've talked about? It's go in a way that others would never go. Forget the inhibitions. It's people who have a desire They have a hunger. They have a visceral taste and relish for destructive control in a way that others couldn't even relate to. It's go on a whole other level. Forget the inhibition. There's got to be a psychophysiology behind that. Now, it hasn't yet been explored. Perhaps somebody who's watching this program will explore it, but good luck rounding up enough sadists to do a study like that on, because it's not like they all jump up and say, here I am, study me. They recognize that their urges are unacceptable, and so they may conceal them to others and look perfectly normal otherwise, just as psychopaths may wear the mask of sanity. So I think that there are a whole range of populations for whom our understanding of psychophysiology would tell us a lot about homicidal violence, including soldiers. And I say this as a very proud and strong supporter of the United States military and militaries of the West. And yet I think we have to appreciate that our soldiers are trained to be conditioned not to have the inhibition to take a life if they have to. So what happens in that deconditioning process to a person's psychophysiology, and how much of that is permanent that extends beyond the battlefield? So I think that there are all kinds of situations and scenarios that reflect the distinct psychophysiology that can contribute to a homicidal decision, either in the go or no go.
That's fantastic, Dr. Welner. Thank you so much. We loved having you on the show. We have so much insight in this world.